Well, welcome to the course. There are different kinds of graduate seminars, and this is a research seminar. So I'm not going to be giving a broad background in any area or teaching the articles that one must have read in order to work in a certain area. I think of the research seminars as aiming to provide, well, an example of some philosophy sort of really getting done now as opposed to the mighty dead. An example of what seeing a project through looks like. And in this case, the project I'm going to be reporting on is one I've been working on basically my entire professional life. That with this just results in the last couple of years, I feel it's all sort of pulled together, that I finally understand a lot of things I've been trying to understand for a long time. So I want to pass that on. Basically, we'll be talking about this book that came out last month, Reasons for Logic, Logic for Reasons. You'll find it, the text in it sort of broken up but accessible from the website. And so if you really wanted to know what the course is about, you could just read the book, and the answer would be, well, I want to present that material, but I want to put it in a context, and I actually want to present it in a somewhat different order, emphasizing different things than have been before. And this is special in a couple of ways. I mean, though the book, title is about logic, and maybe that's the place where we're surest that we made some real advances, but the subtitle is Pragmatic, Semantics, and Conceptual Roles. My title, preferred title for this course is Language and Reasons, or Language and the Structure of Reasons. That's the larger topic that I think we learn a great deal about from approaching this way. But before I talk about the ideas involved, the sort of big picture there, a nice feature of this project is it isn't just Bob. There's a lot of people worked on this project. There's a line of thought that I'll get into in a minute about language, semantics, and logic that I've been developing since making it explicit, so 30 years now. Developed again in my Oxford John Locke lectures, published as Between Saying and Doing in 2008. In those lectures, I felt that I'd taken the logic and the semantics as far as I could take them. There was a lot more to be done, but I'd been banging my head up against it for a decade, and reported how far I got in that book. But there were still all these questions. They seemed to be tractable problems. They were just beyond my abilities. And I started a logic group discussing these, just people at Pitt who were interested in it, but there were various visitors who came through. We started that group in 12 and started to get some real results. But all of the actual results in this book are due to other people. Hlobil, principally, he's the first author on this. He did his Ph.D. in this department in 2016. He's tenured at Concordia University in Montreal, where Dax is a graduate student. And we were both working on results that, though they were published somewhat piecemeal in articles, that Dan Kaplan, our Pitt philosophy Ph.D., pulled together in his 2021 philosophy Ph.D. From Pitt. And indeed, the original plan, so important were Dan's results to this, that the original plan was to have three of us write the book. Ulf and Dan as the ones who presented, who developed the material in the crucial middle three chapters of the book, and then me as the third author, sort of putting a philosophical wrapping around it, saying why these results were particularly important. As things worked out, Dan couldn't work on the project when Ulf and I were actually writing the book, and so he gracefully withdrew from authorship, though you'll see he is liberally acknowledged sort of at every stage, and I will mention as we go along sort of which bits are his. Other important work was done by Ryan Simonelli, not a Pitt PhD. He got his PhD from Chicago Philosophy Department a year ago, but he spent 2 semesters here at different times as a visitor to talk to the Pitt people. He's sort of in our community. And 2 other members of the group, Rhea Golan in Israel and Shuhei Shimamura in Japan, worked in this logic group. It's called Research on Logical Expressivism, ROLL. Worked on it for many years, and their results we'll hear about. So I'm mentioning all of that because this is sort of a Pitt project rather than a Bob project. I motivated it, but they're the ones who really brought it off. So I would say, if and insofar as one was thinking about sort of what contributions is Pittsburgh making to philosophy these days, sort of right now, this is an important one. This project is an important one, and is unusually sort of spread out among Pitt people as far as who's actually doing it. I say logic looms large in the title of the book, in our rationale for it. We're actually going to only spend 1 week, week 6, talking about logic. And there's a lot of material, and I'm willing to talk more about it along the way. But for philosophical purposes, you don't need to be able to do the logic that we do here. You just need to know what we claim it can do. It's only if you're appropriately skeptical or suspicious about that you need to learn enough to really know which handles to pull to do what in the logic. So though we're going to talk about technical matters a lot, you don't actually have to master any particular technical techniques to do what we're going to be doing. Okay, then let me talk some about the ideas. I think about this as being about reasons and understanding and language. We can start with the Greek philosophers, who are the ones who really carved out a notion of reason, of reasons, focusing, and I want to focus on 2 themes that they had. One has to do with reasons and understanding, that they saw that there was a particular kind of understanding that consisted in knowing your way around in the space of reasons, I would say. Being able to grasp reason relations that things stood in to one another. One consideration being a reason for or against another. There's a notion of intelligibility that was essentially rational intelligibility, understanding by mastering the role in reasoning of things. And here, a paradigm is Euclid's geometry, where understanding it is being able to move from axioms and definitions to theorems, from theorems to theorems, understanding how an earlier result provides reasons for later results. That was a distinctive kind of understanding, rational intelligibility. And of course they had the exhilarating idea that that might be what understanding consisted in to core. That rational understanding of the sort whose paradigm is Euclid's geometry might not just be one form of understanding. It might be the form or the ideal form, the best form of understanding. They're contrasting the way a geometer understands the geometry as opposed to the way the land surveyor, the sort of Egyptians who needed to replot the boundaries of the agricultural plots every time the Nile flooded. And you had to come back and say, all right, well, who owns this bit, who owns that bit? They used geometry, but the higher form of that understanding was the theoretical understanding. So connection between reason and understanding on the one hand, where a picture of grasping something as grasping its role in a space of reasons. Second notion, the idea that reasons had a distinctive kind of force. Reasons and the better reasons. The Neo-Kantians, who couldn't have sort of had this thought without Kant, diagnosed this as the force of reasons being normative. As it comes up, in Plato, he's contrasting things you can say that would persuade somebody, things you can say that would change their mind, of the sort that the sophists were concerned with, where sort of any means to get you to believe what I want you to believe or do what I want you to do is good enough for the sophists. They teach techniques for convincing, I should say. And the Greeks were very sensitive, Plato codifying the sensitivity to the difference between that genuine persuasion, which is where you feel the force of the reason or of the better reason and respond to that. And you can see why this was a puzzling sort of force. That's not a way they would talk about it, that's a post-Phrygian way of talking about the force of the reasons. On the one hand, they just aren't always compelling. You can give somebody a good reason for something and then be completely unmoved by it. It's not always compelling. On the other hand, there's a sense in which it's compulsory. You ought to feel the force of the better reason, whether you do or not. But, and again, that's not the way the Greeks would have put it. That's a Neo-Kantian way of putting it. But I think you know, they give us a good perspective on that view. And these were connected in a fascinating way, in that if you did understand something, say a geometrical proof, then you were moved by it. It did make a difference to what you actually believed. Indeed, that's something like the measure of whether you understood Euclid's argument, is whether you saw that if you believed the premises, then you needed to believe the conclusion. Failing to be moved and by the better reason, and failing to understand by grasping the position in the space of reasons that something had, those were two ways of talking about one thing. So that one of the things that was peculiar about this kind of understanding is that it was compelling just insofar as you actually understood what was going on. You only grasped the argument, the reason, if it actually had a grip on you. You're grasping it and it's having a grip on you, two sides of one coin. In the paradigmatic case of geometry, which they had this heaven-storming idea that, okay, maybe everything could be understood like that. Now, huge differences between the way Plato understands that and the way Aristotle understands it. Yeah, I'm waving my hands here. But this is a topic that the Greek philosophers put on the table. And it's distinctive of the Western philosophical tradition to worry about this observation that they made in the vicinity of geometry. I mean, I'm not in a position to do compare and contrast with other philosophical traditions, but this, worrying about this idea is something like the white mythology. It's distinctive of our philosophical tradition, to the point that it's hard to identify, hard for us anyway, to identify as philosophical enterprises or concerns that don't make contact somehow with this constellation of concerns about reason, understanding, and a distinctive kind of discursive normativity. That phrase, the white mythology, is Derrida's, his mythologie blanche. He was talking about something different, specifically different from this general constellation I'm talking about, but it's because he picked out one piece of it. I think would have been happy with extending the phrase in this way. Now, one of the big things that happened to that constellation of ideas was sometime in the late 19th century, sometime in the 19th century, and it became explicit by the end of the century, we philosophers came to think that the way to study reason was to think about language. And that was not an idea that anyone before, Herder, Hegel, Hamann, Humboldt, it came out of the ferment around Kant that language came to the fore. And that's, I think there's a fascinating story there about how that happened. I'm not going to tell that story now. I'm more concerned with why that was a good move, why that was a discovery, that if you're concerned with language if you're concerned with reason, its relation to understanding and the relation of both of those to the distinctive normative force of reasons that so puzzled and fascinated the Greeks, that language is where you should go to study this. It's the real rationale for such extravagant claims as Michael Dummett's claim that philosophy of language is first philosophy. For instance, it's seeing this connection between meaning and understanding, normativity and language. Later on in the course, I'll mention various of the pieces of the discovery of language here, but it's already in a fairly full-blown form in Hegel, one of whose catchphrases is Sprache is the Dasein of Geist. Language is the actual concrete being of, Geist is his word for normativity. And in the 20th century, in European philosophy, the 20th century really was the century of language in European philosophy. Essentially, everyone took on board the lesson that thinking about reason was best pursued by going through language. But it's striking that in the 20th century, philosophers thinking about language split into two opposing camps. And these are roughly the ancestors of analytic philosophy and continental philosophy in the second half of the 20th century. As I say, I think they shared a focus on language, but disagreed about almost everything else. They developed their commitment to the philosophical centrality of language in quite different ways. One tradition, dominant, better worked out, focused on logic to begin with, and later on formal semantics as perspicuous mathematical meta-languages in which to articulate conceptual contents, roles with respect to reason relations, and understand their rational relations to one another. The other tradition wasn't a logical tradition, but an anthropological tradition. It focuses on language as a kind of social practice. This other tradition thinks of language as a prominent feature in the natural history of a certain kind of being, namely us. So if you want to understand human beings, think about their discursive practices. Think about the way they are social beings through the language that they speak. They're focusing on language as parole rather than language as langue in Saussure's terms. So this logico-semantic formalist tradition can be roughly delineated if you follow out a strand through the mighty dead, a strand that leads from Gottlob Frege through Bertrand Russell and the Wittgenstein of the Tractatus to Rudolf Carnap, Alfred Tarski, so Kripke, David Lewis, and Kit Fine. Obviously, there are a lot of other people one could talk about here, but that's a line that one can follow. And its founding achievement was Frege's invention of a logical calculus, a regimented mathematical vocabulary that was adequate to express mathematical reasoning and mathematical concepts in his Grundlagen. And that feat, achievement, he succeeded in doing that. Oh, well, his system turned out to be inconsistent, but he still sort of showed us how to do this. That motivated the project of, well, understanding everything that way in a way that sort of eerily repeats the generalization that Plato made from the geometry that his student Euclid would codify, taking that as a paradigm of understanding and of a specification of conceptual contents, of roles things can play in reasoning. In Russell's hands in particular, he being the ideologist of then nascent analytic philosophy, he says, we should treat Frege's Grundlagen, his mathematical codification of the concepts of, well, arithmetic, we should treat that the way the Greeks treated Euclid's codification of reasoning, as either a model for what understanding consists in general, or as the ideal form of it. The best kind of understanding is the sort of understanding that Frege gave us of, in part 3 of the Begriffsschrift. I've been saying Grundlagen when I should have been saying Begriffsschrift. In part 3 of the Begriffsschrift, when he gives us a definition of the mathematical notion of continuity, of a continuous function, that was a paradigm of actually grasping the content of a concept. And though he only applied his methods to mathematical concepts, Frege himself already believed that what he had was a way of codifying reason relations, and that anything whose content consisted in the role it played in reason relations, you ought to be able to make explicit using his concept script, his Begriffsschrift. Now, a little bit later in that tradition, Tarski's model theory of formal semantics, a formal theory of meaning explicitly now, showed how to give us semantics, well, first for the logical concepts that Frege had used, but then people saw how you could generalize that to give us semantics for non-logical expressions. Carnap was much impressed by the Tarskian achievement, and the next turn of the crank in the tradition was expanding the notion of Tarskian models to the notion of possible worlds, as Kripke and David Lewis taught us to think about them, and the latest development of that, the one that will, of that tradition, the one that we'll engage with is Kit Fine's Truthmaker semantics, which generalizes the possible worlds framework in a useful way. Each of those developments cut its teeth codifying the conceptual contents of specifically logical concepts, but then people showed how you could extend that to capture the conceptual contents of non-logical concepts. So that, as I say, is a very successful research program. And it's the dominant sort of way of thinking about these things in certainly the Anglophone world, but I would say in Western philosophy generally. Let me say something about the other tradition, the anthropological tradition. This begins with those Germans that I mentioned a minute ago, culminating in Hegel, but closer to home, and if we think about the 20th century version of it, in the triumvirate of American pragmatists, Peirce, William James, John Dewey, but includes the Heidegger of Being and Time, 1927, and the later Wittgenstein, particularly in the philosophical investigations. And if we think about contemporary avatars of that sort of broadly pragmatist approach to the philosophy of language, we have in the last generation Rorty, Charles Travis, and Hugh Price are contemporary avatars, I would say, of this tradition. All those figures, these are roughly the ones Rorty talks about as pragmatists in a broad sense, a broad enough sense to include people who are not normally thought of as pragmatists, like Hegel, the early Heidegger, and the later Wittgenstein, thinks of natural languages rather than artificial languages, as the other tradition did, where the other tradition had as its model of reasoning a monological model of proof. So only one individual involved, laying down some axioms and definitions and rules and deriving consequences. That was the original model. This anthropological, natural historical tradition is essentially dialogical. It's thinking about reasons in terms of reasoning as a social practice, practices of giving and asking for reasons, of making claims and challenging and defending them by giving reasons against them or reasons for them, in a public norm-governed space. So they're focusing on discursive practice as what matters about language. Now, a lot of people have worked in both of these traditions. It's astonishing how little communication there was between these. They didn't talk, think, or write about each other, and very seldom could the results that one member of one of the traditions produce be of any use to people in the other traditions. They just seem to be talking past each other. And to pick up the autobiographical note that I had earlier, when I started studying philosophy of language as a graduate student, this was intolerable and unintelligible to me. How could there be people who were saying as good, as useful, as enlightening things as people from both of these traditions were saying, as far as I was concerned, and yet be unable to communicate with each other. How could this be? This was not a tolerable situation. And I want to introduce the ideas in our book by two responses to that situation, two sequential responses that one can make. The first is to say, maybe the trouble is they've just got a hold of different parts of the elephant. There is this phenomenon, language. It has these species, artificial and natural languages. It has these aspects, its logical aspect, its anthropological aspects. Maybe they're just focusing on different aspects of the same thing. Well, what would those be? Well, the later Wittgenstein gives us good ways to think about this. When he's worried about the relationship between meaning and use. Meaning is what that analytic tradition, that logistical tradition focuses on. Frege says early on in the Begriffsschrift, the third paragraph of the Begriffsschrift, that we could imagine two claims, say the Greeks defeated the Persians at the Battle of Plataea, and the Persians were defeated by the Greeks at the Battle of Plataea. And he says, no matter what other premises you combine with those, you get the same consequences from them. And in that sense, we'd say, even though they're different, active voice, passive voice, they don't differ in their meaning, not in their conceptual content, begriffliche Inhalt. And that's what his concept script, his Begriffsschrift, aimed to express. Everything that matters for distinguishing good from bad inferences is going to be captured by his meta-language, and nothing else. It's a pure language of conceptual contents thought of as roles in reasoning. And that notion of meaning, though logic was very helpful for it, by the 30s, so 40 or 50 years into the analytic tradition, it was clear that logic wasn't going to do what Russell had hoped for in the way of codifying conceptual contents. And that's when Tarski's semantic innovation came on the scene and made all things new. But Wittgenstein says there's also the use of expressions, the proprieties that govern making claims, challenging them, defending them, doing everything else that we do with language. And he proposed that we forget about the notion of meaning and just look to describing the use. I can mention in passing here a theme that will come up later. Dummett reads Wittgenstein as a semantic skeptic or even a semantic nihilist, in the sense that he doesn't believe their meanings or conceptual contents. Why not? because Wittgenstein treats meanings as a theoretical concept that we postulate in order to explain proprieties of use. So if, for instance, on the Davidsonian paradigm, semantic paradigm of truth conditions, if we associated truth conditions with sentences as their meanings, and there were some uniform way of deriving different proprieties of use from the meaning that we'd associated with expressions, then we could have a systematic theory of use that postulated meanings and gave us a pragmatics that was an account of how how use depended on meanings. But as Dummett, plausibly in this regard, reads Wittgenstein says, but language is a motley. The use of language is not codifiable by associating some constant meaning with expressions. There is no way to derive the use of things from their meanings. I mean, there's different versions of this, but one of them is that the essence, anyway, part of the essence of language is its plasticity. We're only ever talking about, we're only ever looking at a time slice of practices that are constantly changing. And as they change, the relation between any meaning they had and the use will change. So here's two of his familiar examples. He says, so we used to use talk about containment or being in just for physical things. The kombucha's in the fridge. And when we did that, it always made sense to ask, well, where was it before it was in that container? Where was it before it was in the fridge? But now, by a mechanism that he's very interested in, he would call it a mechanism, by a process he's interested in, we come to extend our talk about what's in what, to talk about where pains are. I have a pain in my tooth. Well now, according to the meaning of in then, it should make sense to ask, where was the pain before it was in your tooth? And yet, it doesn't. Or again, suppose we only use proper names for people. Then it always makes sense to ask of anything that has a proper name, who are its parents? Who's the mother and father of it? But now it turns out that we can extend our practice of giving things proper names to rivers. And we name the river the Nile. Well, who are its parents? Who's the mother? Who's the father? That question doesn't make any sense anymore, but why not? The meaning of unnameable seems to include that. So on Dummett's picture, Wittgenstein sees language as in process to such an extent that any codification of proprieties of use that you could give by assigning meanings would be incredibly fragile and temporary. Maybe you could do it for the way we talk right now, but it isn't going to work for next year and not going to work going forward. Don't look to the meaning, look to the use, Wittgenstein says. Well, the study of the use of the language is not semantics, but pragmatics in a broad sense. By pragmatics, I just will mean the study of the use of language, the study of discursive practices as such. What I've been calling the anthropological tradition says, just worry about that. just worry about discursive practice. Just practice pragmatics. Study language from that point of view. This project of codifying proprieties of use by deriving them from an assignment of meanings, that's a broken back project. Don't do that. You're going to confuse yourself doing that. And if you think about Charles Travis's diatribes against truth conditional semantics, I don't know, in case you're not familiar with the Travis, he will take something, he says, well, the leaves on this plant are green. There's a claim. He looks at a plant and says, leaves on this plant are green. Now, if any sentence should have a set of truth conditions, it should be a sentence like that. There's no funny business going on in that. Is there? And yet, think about the situation where you're, making a video ad and you want the plants to look really good, and the photographer looks and says, those leaves are not green enough, and so the person is sprays green paint on them and says, now the leaves are green, and the photographer agrees, yeah, now they're green. They weren't before. It was a living plant and those, but it wasn't green enough for him. Or another context where what we're really concerned with is whether they're new leaves or have been around for a long time. And we say, well, they sort of look green, but actually those are not green leaves. Well, I'm not doing a good job on behalf of Travis's arguments here, but you can look at him. He argues that almost no claims have got truth conditions that survive from one occasion of their use to another. He's in this pragmatic tradition, thinking about the use of language rather than the meanings. Okay, so I said I wanted to think about our project in terms of two moves from this opposition of two traditions in the philosophy of language. Think about them as focusing on different aspects of language, as practicing two different disciplines: semantics, the study of meaning on the one hand, pragmatics, the study of the use of expressions that have those meanings on the other hand. In a pragmatics first order of explanation of the sort that Dummett and Wittgenstein are talking about, we're supposed to understand meanings in terms of the role that something plays in discursive practice, the proprieties of use of it. That's a pragmatics first order of explanation. But at any rate, at the end of the day, whether you care about the pragmatics or the semantics, you better worry about the relation between those two things. What kind of pragmatics goes with your hyper-intentional Feinean semantics, and what kind of semantics goes with the bits of discursive practice that you're talking about. When we look at moral discourse, practical argumentation about what we ought to do, what reasons are better or more powerful or overriding of others, should we think of those as having meanings of the sort that the leaves of this plant are green has? Is it a descriptive sort of meaning that it has, or is it a different kind of meaning? If you're doing the pragmatics, you ought to worry about semantics as well. That's the first move. is to bring language into the story again and say, yeah, and you should think about that distinction between pragmatics as the study of use and semantics as the study of meaning. You should think of that in terms of the difference between two meta-languages. I'll say metavocabularies, and thereon hangs a tale. You can either discuss language in a semantic metavocabulary, for instance, a representational semantic metavocabulary. That's, well, what are you referring to? What are you talking about? How are you classifying things as being? Or you can talk in a pragmatic metavocabulary. How is it appropriate to respond to this speech act? What roles do speech acts play with respect to appropriate moves to and from them? Let's say. A pragmatic metavocabulary is going to be a normative vocabulary. It's proprieties of use that one wants to, how it's correct to use the expressions, that's what one wants to capture. So the second move is to think about these two aspects, not in terms of the study of them, but of the language that you do it in. And in fact, focusing on semantic and pragmatic metavocabularies turns out to give us a good way to understand logical metavocabularies as another kind of metavocabulary for talking about languages. And Dan Kaplan's innovation, implication space semantics, is a non-representational semantic metavocabulary, an inferentialist one, the sort I've been dreaming about forever. That's a fourth kind of metavocabulary. And what we're mostly doing here, well, is developing particular versions of these metavocabularies, particular versions that fit together in remarkably symmetric and satisfying ways. As we've got a constellation of metavocabularies for talking about language and reasons in language, a constellation of rational metavocabularies that is just remarkably illuminating. I mean, that's a promissory note I'm issuing to you, that we'll understand lots of things when we understand the relations between these metavocabularies. Now, one of the rate-limiting factors I found as I was thinking about this introductory presentation is that really, in order to know what the course is going to be about, you're going to have to hang around for the first 4 meetings. I really can't get all the raw materials out on the table, in one. Now, I mean, that's only till the end of the month. It's not that bad. But if you want to jump ahead, I've linked in week 4 to an essay called A Tune Beyond Us Yet Ourselves, which is the most recent thing I've written, is presenting basically material from chapter 4 of the book, Wolf's Argument, which I did in April at the NYU Columbia Graduate Student Conference, and since have given to groups in Paris and in Beijing. That's meant to be a way into the relation specifically between semantic and pragmatic metavocabularies as it shows up for us. without worrying about logic, without worrying about implication space semantics. That's meant to be processable sort of from wherever you are coming in. And so if you wanted to jump ahead and see whether it's worth waiting 4 weeks to know whether this is going to be of any interest, that's the best single thing to look at, is that essay. And two things that, two sort of joint requirements of working out this metalinguistic way of thinking about reasons, a metalinguistic functionalism about reasons, are to ask first, well, if we're going to think about, if it's going to help us in thinking about the relation between semantics and pragmatics, and so about the relation between these two different traditions in the philosophy of language, if it's going to help in thinking about those things to distinguish semantic metavocabularies from pragmatic metavocabularies, how should we characterize the common topic? Sort of the first move, thinking, well, it's semantics and pragmatics, is saying, well, they really have different topics. Those are aspects of one thing. They're aspects of talk, let's say, but they're really talking about different things. That's why talking past each other and not listening to each other was not just some psychological incapacity. There was a real reason for it. And now we say, well, we think it's going to be useful to think about the languages they're using in talking about whatever they're talking about. Look at the differences between the vocabulary you use to do pragmatics, to talk about proprieties of use, and the vocabulary you use to talk about meanings, paradigmatically, or representational, referential, Tarskian, semantic vocabulary that's been through these changes to its Kripke-Lewis possible worlds version and to its fine hyperintentional version, but still, how are we to think about what they're both metavocabularies of? And here, the idea is, well, they're talking about reason relations. On the one hand, they're talking about reasoning, practices of reasoning, and on the other hand, they're talking about what semantic relations, things, but let's say claimables, stand into one another when one of them's a reason for or against the other. Because the thought, vague as it is that meanings are roles with respect to reason relations. That was a vague enough idea to see already in Plato, for instance. Well, can we get a notion of reason relations that's definite enough to work with, but that would let us say that people in the anthropological tradition were working in pragmatic metavocabularies for reason relations, and people in the logistical semantic tradition are looking at semantic metavocabularies for reason relations. And here the core theoretical concept of the project is that of a vocabulary, which will be the topic of next week's session, sort of the backgrounds, why call it that, what are the alternatives, and so on. But I can say now a technical notion of a vocabulary that we introduce is a set, a lexicon. Think of it as a set of sentences, but think of them just as repeatable sign designs. The signpost considered just as a piece of wood, as Wittgenstein says. We have a set of sentences and then a set of reason relations on it. So it's a relational structure. The reason relations, principally implication, codifying being a reason for, and incompatibility, codifying being a reason against. Lots more to say before we're entitled to talk that way, but take a set of sentences, but they could just be sentence letters, and conjoin it with a set of reason relations. So we have the relational structure that is that ordered pair. That's the technical notion of a vocabulary. Depends on, mostly consists in the technical notion of reason relations. And there's a lot to be said about those. That's why it'll take me a couple weeks to sort of get this out on the table. For instance, why are there two of them? Should we think of implication as holding between a premise sentence and a conclusion sentence, or a premises that's a set of sentences and a single conclusion, or as a pair of sets of sentences, premises and conclusions? Those are issues about the formal properties. What about the algebraic properties of reason relations? Is it the case, for instance, that the principle we'll call CO, containment, is satisfied? That is, if P is a premise, then you can conclude P. That is, that the premises are included in the containment. We're actually going to assume that, though. Is it monotonic? That is, if from some set of premises a certain conclusion follows, if you throw in some more premises, does the conclusion still follow? Is it transitive? And then we'll see that there's other weaker conditions. Cautious monotonicity says, well, it may be that even though from premise set S, the conclusion P follows, there could be a superset of S from which P doesn't follow. But you can't defeat that inference by adding anything that was already a consequence. Cautious monotonicity says, though there may be defeaters, things that are already implied are not defeaters. God, is it kind of transitivity? Well, there's a bunch of these. These are all questions about the form or structure of reason relations. So, for instance, let me just lay down as a claim, say there's two basic flavors of reason relation, implication and incompatibility, corresponding to being a reason for and being a reason against. Incompatibility is de jure symmetric, and implication is not. Why is that? Does it have to be that way? Those are sorts of questions about the structure of reasons that are only approachable, I want to say, from a linguistic point of view, and we can shed particular light on by thinking in the context I'm working with, in the context of this project. So at the center of the project is this technical concept of a vocabulary that we're going to fill in and then use to do all the work. That's what's going to stand in for languages in our. Languages are things that incorporate or exhibit reason relations as part of their structure. I'll say more about this tomorrow and next week. And we can think about ground level vocabularies like English or ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary generally, or the vocabulary that correspond, well, I don't know, culinary or nautical vocabulary. Corresponding to any of them, there's going to be a set of sentences and a set of reason relations. Nautical vocabulary is going to tell us about the relation between something being a sloop and something having a mizzenmast. Is that a reason against or a reason for? Mastering the vocabulary is knowing your way around that nautical vocabulary. Ground level vocabularies like that, we're going to think of as sets of sentences structured by reason relations. And then we're going to talk about ways of specifying those vocabularies that are themselves vocabularies. Pragmatic or semantic metavocabularies, which explain or express the reason relations of the ground level vocabularies. Now I say explain or express because the second question we have to ask is, well, what do you mean by a metavocabulary? Tarski, who invented the notion, requires that a metavocabulary have in it singular terms that refer to the expressions of the object vocabulary. That's what's distinctive of metavocabularies. Even syntactic metavocabularies or phonological metavocabularies, they have expressions that refer to, expressions in the metavocabulary that refer to lexical units, syntactic units, or phonological units. That's what makes them metavocabularies. But it turns out that notion of a metavocabulary isn't flexible enough to do what we're aiming to do with it, to bring semantic and pragmatic metavocabularies into real conversation with each other. You can't do that with that notion of what makes a vocabulary a meta-vocabulary. So we need something that's precise enough to work with, but more flexible than that. Notion, as I say, explain or express the reason relations. Because reason relations, like implications, are things that you can express without referring to. And here, if you think about a logical metavocabulary, I said the two basic flavors of reason relation are implications and incompatibilities. You express those reason relations in a logical vocabulary with conditionals and negation. Those let you say that one thing follows from another or is incompatible with it. So we can say, instead of just treating the move from P to Q as a good one, treating in practice P as giving us a reason for Q, whatever treating it as in practice, doing that is, instead of just doing that practically, we have a new claimable P arrow Q, or P horseshoe Q. Let me say arrow because that's not really the conditional we're going to want. The horseshoe isn't. But now we have a claimable P arrow Q such that by committing yourself to that, you're licensing the move from P to Q. You're saying that is a good implication. And similarly, if I say P arrow not Q, I'm saying they're incompatible. Not just treating them in fact, P as a reason against Q, but I'm saying that P is a reason against Q. Now I can do that even though the expressions in the logical vocabulary are not singular terms picking out expressions in the base vocabulary, because reason relations are themselves the sort of thing that can be said, that can be expressed. So something can be a metavocabulary by having the expressive power to make explicit, in the form of claimables, reason relations. And that's a crucial part of our being able to change the reason relations, reason about them, change them, and so develop the language. So in addition to the technical notion of a vocabulary, we need a technical notion of a meta-vocabulary in order to bring off this enterprise. Okay, that was a long disquisition, but I hope it set up at least a general project is let's get the pragmatics and semantics together, and the raw materials for an argument that language is the place to go to do that, because we need to understand how the rational metavocabularies work, because that's how we reason about reason relations. That's how we think about them, is using these rational metavocabularies. So the languages, the vocabularies come in twice as the medium of reason relations. The medium in which reason relations appear is in the use of sentences, using some sentences as implying others or as incompatible with others. That is, using the sentences as standing in reason relations. Now we're going to need a precise way of saying what that is, but we've got one. And then we're going to look at the vocabularies that you can use to talk about those reason relations, to express them in the way semantics does, in the way pragmatics does, in the way logic does, and in other ways as well. So this is meant to be a vindication of the modern insight, I now want to say, that language is the medium of reason relations. That's what the pre-Kantians did not sufficiently appreciate. Okay. Any comments or questions about that view from 10,000 feet up? Yeah.
Is there a sense in which pragmatic vocabularies are supposed to be more basic than the semantic vocabularies?
I mean, I've tried to tell the story in an even-handed way here, but yes, that is, our story is going to be a pragmatics first story, in that the only way I know to argue, let me start a little farther back. I had as the title Language and the Structure of Reasons, and talked about some of the issues with structures of reasons here. The tradition says, the logistical tradition is the one that has thought about this as implication. I'll tell you what I mean by implication. Tarski says the concept of logical consequence. That's a topological closure operator. Right? It's an operation on sentences. Take the consequence of, so we have sentences and sets of sentences S, and for each set of sentences we have C of S, the consequences of S, and that's another set. It's going to be a superset of the original set, that's CO, CS contains S, hence the name. It's monotonic in that if S prime is a superset of S, then C of S prime is a superset of C of S. It satisfies the condition, the topological conditions to be a topological closure operator. That's what I mean, Tarski says, by an implication relation. And we say, well, that isn't going to help us if we're thinking about, say, culinary vocabulary, because the reason relations having to do with sloops and mizzenmasts just don't satisfy all those conditions. So what do we want? Well, we want a universal rational metavocabulary, one that's adequate to express any set of reason relations at all. And he says, and that's not restricted to the closed ones, the topologically closed ones, but to any of them. Well, what do you mean by reason relations in that case, then? These sound like just relations that you want to express. Where's the restriction to reason relations? And the only way I know to answer that question is to look to the pragmatics, to say, well, I'm talking about the practices of taking or treating one set of speech acts as providing reasons for performing other speech acts or against them. Slightly less vaguely, we're looking at practices of making claims, that's the primary thing, and challenging them by making other claims that are, in the eyes of the community, reasons against the claim you made, and defending them by making further claims that are, in the eyes of the community, reasons for the claim that was made. And it's being able to be treated as reason relations like that that defines the set of relations we're after. So we want to go pragmatics first. Now, Kit Fine, it goes semantics first. Indeed, he has only a vestigial pragmatics at best, but we're going to be able to give him a pragmatic, give him a detailed pragmatics for Truthmaker semantics by starting from the pragmatic side. One of the things we'll be looking at is the relations between metavocabularies, or let's just say relations between vocabularies, because the metavocabulary relation is one. Next week we'll get in place the conceptual tools to talk very generally about that. One of the reasons that people haven't been able to see the relations between pragmatics and semantics that we do in Chapter 4 and in that Attune Beyond Us Yet Ourselves essay is that nobody's had a sufficiently precise pragmatics to actually lay alongside the semantics. But we're working with the thought that what it is for a sentence, a repeatable sign design, a noise kind, to express a claimable is for it to be playing this pragmatic normative role in a set of practices. At any rate, you have to do that in order to be entitled to say that this relation that you've picked out is implication or is incompatibility. Okay, why don't we take our break now? Let's take 15 minutes, and so come back at 2:37. hope that's functioning. Okay, well, questions or comments after a little time for a little bit of thought? Okay, let me plunge into what I think of as a subtle and difficult issue that may give, I don't know, an example of the kind of thing that we might discover. So there's of a phenomenon that we might shed some light on by using some of the ideas that we're going to pursue here. And this is what I'll just call the basic discursive bipolarity. And if you think about the Phrygian tradition, it starts with a distinction between truth and falsity. Those are the truth values, the true and the false, that Frege assigned to different sentences. And the paradigm of semantics, really the first sort of one, I don't know, that you would introduce a student to, is the two-valued semantics for propositional logic, for classic propositional logic. Assign one of these values to each of the sentences, and we can show you how they work in reasoning. And we can define logical sentences from them just in terms of their truth values. Now we ask, well, how should we think about this opposition between truth and falsity? Well, I said there's a basic discursive bipolarity. True and false is the semantic version of it. But there's a pragmatic version as well. Truth and falsity are intimately and inextricably tied up with the practical attitudes of acceptance and rejection of a claim. On the pragmatic side, those attitudes, relations between a claim and an individual and a human, a speaker, that's an expression of or anyway, it's correlated with the semantic opposition. And we can be a little bit more explicit about the correlation. We can say accepting a claimable, accepting that P, is taking it to be true. And rejecting that claimable is taking it to be false. So in a standard setting, we'd simply use difference between truth and falsity. That semantic difference, that's fundamental. And it affects our practice because we adopt attitudes of taking true and taking false, which just is accepting or rejecting. Which, when we're doing the pragmatics, the paradigmatic expression of accepting is asserting, and the paradigmatic expression or manifestation of rejecting is denying. So we could talk about assertion and denial as speech acts that, in the purely pragmatic sense, express attitudes of acceptance and rejection. But all that's on the pragmatic side. On the semantic side, we have true and false. Those two sides linked by the principle that accepting, expressed by assertion, is taking true, and rejecting, expressed by denial, is taking false. And a standard order of explanation would say, well, look, I'm going to explain to you about true and false, and then in the pragmatics, you say, well, how it would be appropriate to take or treat something if it were true or if it were false. But actually, people don't work in pragmatics very much at that level of abstraction. Or one might aim to go the other way around and say, well, in a pragmatics first order of explanation, I was just talking about a semantics first order of explanation, starts with true and false, moves to a notion of taking true, taking false, and understands the practical attitudes of acceptance and rejection in terms of those. Work to be done at each stage, but that's the way you're going. Or you could turn that on its head and say, truth is a pretty mysterious notion. The only grip we've really got on it is it's the property you're taking a claimable to have if you accept it. And falsity is the property you're taking a claimable to have if you reject it. Now, can we work back from those practical attitudes? What do you have to do to be accepting and rejecting? Can we work back from that to a notion of truth or falsity? I want to say, well, it's the same bipolarity here that shows up semantically as true or false and pragmatically as acceptance or rejection. What I was gesturing at was the idea that you might take one of these versions as explanatorily prior to the other. But one of the things you want to do, if you're concerned to understand how what you say in a semantic metavocabulary relates to what you say in a pragmatic metavocabulary, one prime locus for doing that is looking at this basic discursive bipolarity that has those two manifestations. Now, what could we say about it, sort of at the level of generality that isn't sensitive to the specific difference between the semantic and the pragmatic versions of it? Well, it's of the essence of this bipolarity that there's a kind of exclusion to it, a kind of repulsion of them. In the paradigmatic semantic language game, nothing is both true and false. If it's true, then it's not false. If it's false, it's not true. They are disjoint classifiers of claimables or sentences, declarative sentences. It's impossible. This exclusion is a modally robust exclusion. It's impossible that the same claim should be both true and false. And this has widely been thought to be, this exclusion relation has widely been thought to be a more basic feature of this basic discursive bipolarity. Sorry, I don't know how I was going to end that sentence. The exclusiveness of them that gets expressed logically in the law of non-contradiction, which doesn't mention truth and falsity, but has the way we express these things, that's been widely thought to be less fundamental than excluded middle, that says, well, anything has to be either true or false. If it's a meaningful claim, then the world has to either make it true or false. This modally robust exclusiveness of the two. Now, I mentioned not here. My sense is that mostly when people think about the relationship between truth and falsity, they're comfortable philosophically working in a sufficiently expressively rich meta-language that they help themselves to logical vocabulary and can say things like, well, false just means not true, and true just means not false. But in fact, as we'll see going forward, it's not obvious anyway that the notion of negation is more fundamental than the distinction between truth and falsity. That is, than this basic discursive bipolarity. It may be that if you don't understand the bipolarity, then you can't understand negation either. That is, that negation is a bit of logical vocabulary that helps us make explicit and so talk about the bipolarity, but that it's downstream. Now later on when we look at this and talk about logical expressivism, in the contemporary literature, this is the difference between understanding negation on the Australian plan and understanding it on the American plan in the contemporary idiom. And unfortunately, we Americans get stuck with the flat-footed semantics first, and then logic first, and then semantics story. But at any rate, I'm going to put negation and logical things to one side in asking this question, because I'll argue later on that negation depends on this. This is more fundamental. Well, that opposition, though, is symmetric. It's not picking out one of the truth values as different from the other. They both exclude each other. And if you think about truth tables and in maybe logic, if you just start off, you can define truth functions with any function of truth values to truth values. You could swap all the F's for T's and you still get a function, a truth function. There's a symmetry between these. But they're not just symmetric. Remember, this is acceptance and rejection as well as truth and falsity. There is a certain privilege that the true has, that acceptance has. There's a sense in which falsity is a second-class truth value. We couldn't, in fact, just swap truth and falsity in our practice, because we're aiming to say the true things. What we're concerned about is acceptances more than rejections. Now this is extremely delicate to say, what is that asymmetric feature of the relation? I'm trying to break down this basic discursive bipolarity. I'm saying, well, there's this exclusion, and that exclusion is symmetric. So there's a modally robust symmetric relation between these truth values that's reflected anyway, mirrored, that's not any better, I want to say these things are on a par, without saying that one of them comes first and the other is a mirror of it. On the pragmatic side of acceptance and rejection, again, those, you're not to accept and reject the very same thing. That's wrong, normatively wrong. You might do it, but it'd be out of bounds. They exclude one another, and that's a symmetric relation. But the bipolarity itself is not purely symmetric. There's another aspect to it that privileges truth over falsity, acceptance over rejection. Now, Dummett, in his fabulous Frege's Philosophy of Language book, argues in his chapter on assertion that if you look at the practices of assertion and the pragmatic side, you'll see what this privileging is, what breaks the symmetry of what I'm calling the basic discursive bipolarity. That you couldn't have a practice that was like our practice, but involved denials as the fundamental speech act rather than assertions. Unfortunately, he doesn't give a very good argument for it. He's passionate, but I think not convincing, even though he's right about this. But what is the difference? And I think this is a really important point. The difference comes up when and only when you think about reasoning. Good reasons preserve truth, not falsity. If you do your truth values or your multi-valued, matrix-valued semantics, you've got all these truth values. Let's say we're in a three-valued system. You've got three values now. We're not sort of respecting. We don't just have true and false, but only one of them, well, only some of them, are designated values. And to see the function of those, you have to look at the definition of validity or consequence that says that good implications preserve truth, not any of the other truth values. In a multi-valued logic, it's the designated values that have to be preserved by good implications. So something's a tautology if no matter what assignment of values you give to it, it gets a designated value. But what makes it a designated value is that that's what's preserved by good inferences. I say, the true claims are the ones you want. Well, that's because those are the ones you can reason from. You can use as premises in your reasoning. If you accept the premises, then you're going to accept the conclusion. Truth is the one of the truth values that's preserved by good inferences. But you've got to look at the relation between truth values and inference in order to see that asymmetric relation between them. And that's to say that the reason relations are an essential element of that fundamental discursive bipolarity. Apart from the reason relations, you can't understand the difference between truth and falsity if by that you mean not just that they're different, but which one is true. It's only the role in reason relations that makes that difference make a difference. And indeed, I want to claim that when the dust has settled, we'll see that in order to understand the relation between the semantic version of the basic bipolarity, truth and falsity, and the pragmatic version, acceptance and rejection, you have to understand the the version of that same bipolarity, the way it shows up in reason relations. And that's the distinction between implication and incompatibility. And furthermore, that incompatibility is symmetric. That's, as it were, why truth and falsity exclude one another in this modally robust way. Incompatibility is the reason relation that's codifying that symmetric modally robust exclusion relation that's essential to the fundamental discursive bipolarity. Whereas what distinguishes them is their role in implication. They play the same role in incompatibility, they play a different role in implication. And I claim you're not going to understand the fundamental discursive bipolarity unless you're thinking not just about the semantic version of it, not just about the pragmatic version of it, but this reason relation version of it. I don't claim that you can make sense of the reason relations antecedently and independently of these other dimensions of it. I just claim it's an essential element of that bipolarity. Essential in that you can't understand the bipolarity unless you see it as manifesting also in this division between two kinds of reason relation, which are essentially reasons for and reasons against, which are reasons to accept as opposed to reasons to deny. So, I mean, that's how those reason relations are connecting on the pragmatic side, and good implications on the semantic side have to be truth-preserving, whereas there isn't a requirement like that as far as incompatibilities are concerned. If we systematically swap all the T's for F's, all the incompatibilities will be the same. The implications won't. So, I mean, I'm offering an example here of what really is a fundamental feature of thought and language, this basic discursive bipolarity, which has, if you look at it carefully, this rich but subtle structure to it. It has a symmetric, modally robust exclusiveness component, and it has an asymmetric component where one of the sides of the bipolarity is privileged, plays a role that the other side doesn't play, and which wouldn't be preserved by systematically swapping all the things with one value for all the things with the other value. So there's a sort of puzzle. I mean, this is discussed not very much by philosophers, I think, but sort of, what would you say about it, I think is the question. And I'm not telling a story about how all these are related, that I need things I don't have on the table to do that. But I'm suggesting the kind of thing that we're going to see as illuminating is to see that there is this third flavor of third shape that the fundamental discursive bipolarity can take in reason relations. And I'm just claiming, promissory note here, that understanding its role will help us see how the symmetric and asymmetric aspects of the fundamental discursive bipolarity are related to one another, and how the semantic and pragmatic versions of it are. So this notion, I said, at the conceptual center of our project is this notion of reason relations, of come in the two flavors of implication and incompatibility. Well, that they come in those two flavors, not just one and not three, just two, these two. That is a manifestation of the fundamental discursive bipolarity. But why is it? And when we ask, why do these things go together? How do they hang together? That's what seeing the reason relations version is supposed to help with. So I say this, at the conceptual center of our project is this notion of reason relations, and so of a vocabulary that just is a bunch of sentences that can stand in reason, and a constellation of reason relations, a relational structure consisting of a set and relations on that set, same as a Tarskian model as far as that goes. I call these sentences, anything that can stand in reason relations is a sentence, so it's that's a cheap compliment. You have a domain, and if the relations on the domain are reason relations, then we can call those sentences. There will be more to say about that later, but for now, that's what I've got here. Here's well, I don't know. So let me stop there before I pile on. Anything anybody wants to say about that? As I say, I think these issues are genuinely hard, but that they're clearly sort of important how these things are related.
Would you say that truth is somehow more fundamental than falsity?
Or better, or something. It's privileged somehow.
This is the question. What are we saying here about the asymmetry?
Well, so I told you what I really think it is. It's that's what's preserved by good inferences. And you say, well, why do you want the good inferences? Because those are the good ones. And I think a case can be made for that better than saying, well, aren't the true claims the good claims? Yes, but because of their role in inference, or anyway, you can't understand the sense in which the true claims are the good claims unless you think about their role, well, because those are the ones then, if you make good inferences from them, you get to more of those. If you don't say that, I don't know, in contemporary epistemology, you'll find people like Hartree-Field saying, well, true claims are the ones we want to be contagious. Truth is the property not of actually being contagious, but of it's the property such that the ideal is that the things that have that are contagious. so that which ones do we want to be spread around the community by testimony? The true ones. That's his functional account. Well, why is that? Why couldn't we just systematically swap and say, well, couldn't it be the false ones? I think his view is no, whichever ones we want to be contagious, those are the ones we say are true. That's how you tell the difference between them, is that we have this practical attitude that we're trying to promote one class of claims over other, the contagiousness of one class of claims over the other. And whichever one that is, that deserves to be called true. I might be putting words in his mouth there. I wouldn't hold him responsible for that version of it. Yeah.
So one of the reasons I asked is because it seems like if we were to switch all the truths for falses, then our logical consequence relation would just be the converse of the relation we had. Whenever A was be a reason for B, we switch them, then B is now a reason for A. And then now it seems like, well, yeah, truth, consequence, or reason relations preserve truth, but they also, converse, preserve falsity. So it seems like, well, maybe there's still a symmetry here.
Yeah. A version of this fundamental bipolarity, if you think about sequent calculus, and so you have a chain of sequence, and truth is preserved going down, and falsity is preserved going up. So you say, well, looks symmetric to me, and it is. We can make sense of symmetry. It's just you're missing something about the distinction between truth and falsity, or acceptance and rejection, if you can't break the symmetry, if you can't say what privileges one of them. And I think this has been philosophically talked about, maybe not in quite these terms, but people have wondered why not. We can, if we swap acceptance for rejection, so assertion for denial, and unnegated claims for negated claims, and conjoined claims for disjoined claims, and vice versa, everything stays the same, sort of formally. We can induce that symmetry on it. There's something we're not getting by that. There is a privileging, there is a sense in which the true is privileged. There's an asymmetry in the truth functional definition of two-valued implication, right? That only one of the four cases is ruled out, the one where you're going from true to false. That's the only one. Swap that around. Well, what's the other notion of implication good for? Well, one's going to have to come back to pragmatics, I think, to respond to this, which is going to suggest that the pragmatic version is more fundamental than the semantic version, and I'm suggesting the reason relation version is the one that's going to combine those. But you better do the pragmatics more seriously than people have done it in order to be able to break that symmetry. That's week 3. We're going to give our pragmatics, or jump ahead and read chapter 1 of the book if you're curious about it. I would say, when I say that this strikes me as a subtle question, not just a hard one. Those are different assessments is that distinguishing the symmetric aspect from the asymmetric privileging, that's a subtle distinction, and it is because it's so hard to say what the privileging is. What the privileging consists in. Why true? Frege would have been, so in the final work in the Grundgesetze, where he's actually deriving arithmetic from logic, the true is the statement that every object is identical to itself. And Frege is aware that, so for all x, x equals x. That, he says, I'm going to treat that, that's the true. And he's aware that he could have picked any other sort of tautology. So that much is conventional. But if you say, well, couldn't you have picked x does not equal x? He would have said, absolutely not. That would be a hitherto unknown form of madness, phrase he uses in a different connection. Why? Because those other claims aren't true. They're actually names of the false. And you can't use one of them as a name of the true. That would be, building in this mistake at the base of your system. Well, that's to say he had a sort of robust realist sense about the true and what difference it made. Didn't articulate what the privileging is, though. Why couldn't we just use names for the false instead of names for the true, but have them do everything that names for the true did? Because it's the true, he would have said. His view was, if you didn't privilege the true, his understanding of accepting something was recognizing it as a name of the true. Well, couldn't we just, what about recognizing things as the name of the false? Could that have gone through? Yeah. So I think it's subtle to say what the privileging is. It's a worthwhile enterprise to try and deny it. Try and work with a thoroughgoing symmetric connection. I think it's going to be the pragmatics is where it's going to fall down. But saying how, that's a hard question, not a subtle question. What you're trying to do is subtle. Trying to do it is hard. That's what I want to say here. So, yeah, I don't have enough on the table yet to sort of go further with this. But this is an example of something fundamental that I think, I'm issuing this promissory note that we can cast real light on by thinking about it in terms of the reason relations. So this technical notion of reason relations vocabulary, those are really just, it's the same notion. A vocabulary that lets you discuss reason relations is a rational metavocabulary. And you should distinguish the notion of reason relations at the beginning of the project and the notion of reason relations at the end. I've put it in play the notion of reason relations in various ways. At the end of the day, though, when we have all the machinery available, we're going to have 4 different kinds of metavocabulary that are rational metavocabularies, 2 of which offer explanations of reason relations, and 2 of which offer explications of reason relations. And our official view at the end of the day is, and by reason relations, if you want to know what we're talking about with reason relations, that's what these 4 kinds of metavocabulary have in common. That's what semantic and pragmatic rational metavocabularies offer explanations of. And that's what logical and implication space rational metavocabularies offer explications of. So at the end of the day, we're going to say this crucial technical notion, the one that's at the center of the project, when you've understood these kinds of metavocabularies, it's the one that all those arrows are pointing at. It's the common topic of explanation by pragmatic and semantic rational metavocabularies, and explication, making explicit, by logical and implication space metavocabularies. And we'll specify each of those metavocabularies, the semantic, the pragmatic, the logical, and the implication space, as a vocabulary in that technical sense. That is, we'll specify them by specifying their reason relations. Reason relations in the metavocabulary that you use to explain or make explicit reason relations in the base vocabulary. Now I can say just a word about explanation versus explication in this sense. The question is whether you have to appeal to anything outside the base vocabulary in your story. And it's distinctive of logical vocabulary that if you start with ordinary empirical descriptive vocabulary, say, with its reason relations, that you can systematically introduce logical vocabulary into it, extend the language, compute the reason relations of the logically extended language from the reason relations of the base language. You can do that for any vocabulary. Logical vocabulary is universal in that regard, and it doesn't need anything that isn't in the base vocabulary. Its rules and the base vocabulary, and it will give us the expressive means to make explicit implications with conditionals and incompatibilities with negations, and implication space semantics, again, only appeals to the reason relations of the base vocabulary, the one that it's a semantics for. It doesn't look to anything else. Implication space semantics is Dan Kaplan's version of, I mean, it's a huge transformation of, but it's based on Girard's phase space semantics for linear logic. That most logicians, as opposed to computer scientists, I think would say about Girard's semantics, yeah, well, it's pretty, but in what sense is it a semantics? Computer scientists don't really care about that, I think. Kaplan's version shows why it's a semantics. Anyway, it's also purely explicative. It only appeals to the reason relations of the base vocabulary, the one that it's a metavocabulary for. Semantics, well, the version we're going to look at, representational semantics, as Kit finds, that's the latest and the greatest, and it really is a super advance. It says, look, we work with a metaphysics that goes with this Truthmaker semantics. We have a universe of states and a fusion relation on states, which amounts to an ordering among the states, a mereological ordering among the states. And we have a distinguished set of the states that are the impossible states. And the reason Q follows from P is that the explanation of Q following from P, sort of what it means for Q to follow from P, is that every exact truthmaker of P is an exact truthmaker of Q. That's what we mean. He's actually got 2 or 3 different notions of consequence, and we're going to say he didn't get the best one, the 4th one that he needs. But the point is, you explain what follows from what among sentences by going through the metaphysical states that are the truth makers and false makers of those sentences. So you appeal to the metaphysical states, and they explain why, or in what sense, one thing follows from another. So that's an explanation of the reason relations in some base vocabulary, because it's appealing to something that isn't in the reason relations of the base vocabulary, namely all these states. That's what the semantics does. In the pragmatics, we appeal to the practices of the community. We say, look, what it is for it to be an implication relation is that in the community it's appropriate to offer this as a justification for that. Or for incompatibility, this counts as a challenge to that. So in terms of the norms and the speech acts, we explain what we mean by one thing following from another, what it is for one thing to follow from another. In the pragmatic sense, is for the one thing to be taken or treated in practice as a reason for or a reason against. And that's a matter of challenging and defending claims. Now again, we're appealing to something that isn't in the reason relations of our, say, nautical vocabulary that we're looking at the reason relations of, but our pragmatic rational metavocabulary is appealing to these commitments and speech acts and norms, which are not in the nautical vocabulary. So, though the pragmatic metavocabulary is appealing to quite different things, in our full-blown version, they're committed to invoking in their explanations normative statuses of commitment and entitlement, and to speech acts of claiming, challenging, and justifying, none of which have to be mentioned in the vocabulary that we're making explicit. So both of those are substantive explanatory theories, the semantic and the pragmatic, for reason relations. Logic and implications-based semantics are not. They just give me the reason relations of the base vocabulary, and I'll give my explication of them. I'll unfold, make explicit what they are, each in a different way, one in a logical way and the other in a semantic way. Okay, and just to repeat, at the end of the day, our understanding of reason relations is going to be what you can explain the way Kit Fine does, semantically, representationally semantically. We have a specific Truthmaker explanation of it, consequence, the right consequence relation in the Truthmaker setting is to take a set of sentences gamma to imply a set of sentences delta if the fusion of every truthmaker of all of gamma with a false maker of every element of delta is always an impossible state. That's not a relation that he considers. It's along the lines of what he's got. But if you use that relation, then well, right, that's our privileged one. So at the end of the day, we're going to focus in on the reason relations, the topic of our project, but we're saying what's at the core of discourse is these reason relations of thinkability and intelligibility and so on. We'll be able to pick them out as the common topic of the explanations of this semantic theory and this pragmatic theory, and of the explications by this kind of logic and this kind of implication space vocabulary. So that's where we're going with this. And we're basically going to march through those. We'll do the, in week 3, we'll look at the pragmatics. In week 4, we'll look at the semantics and the mapping between them, an isomorphism between them that was invisible to people before because they weren't working at the level of reason relations, and actually because nobody has a pragmatics sort of worked out at this at a level that would permit you to prove an isomorphism there. And then we'll look at the logic and the implication semantics, packing all that into 1 week. I don't know, week 6 is going to be full, but I believe we can do it all because you just need to see what it does, not in detail how everything does it. You'll have all the text if you want to do that. There's one more topic I should put on the table before we go, which is something else I believe we'll learn a lot about, is top-down explanations. As opposed to, well, obviously bottom-up explanation, but atomistic explanations that start with, some set of items that we can define and define the relations among them, and then we build up in systematic ways to the rest of the stuff we have. As opposed to starting with a big relational structure and understanding things in terms of the roles that items play in that relational structure. That's a kind of explanation, I'll call it relational rather than atomistic. It comes up concretely in the semantic area where you don't get very far just with truth values in semantics. You need to look, building up atomistically, starting with these truth values, you need to look at functions mapping something onto truth values, mapping indices of places or times or worlds or whatever onto the truth values. You go intentional with an S in the atomistic structure by applying functions from things you've already got to things you've already got, and move up functionally to intensions. It's different if you go down. Most of our philosophical use of technical material has been bottom up, has been atomistic. That's what brought us to the party. That's what we know how to do. For many reasons, and in many contexts, that's not the most promising form of explanation. Moving down from above is, let me say, on the semantic side, I'm not going to be able to find this quote early enough. Anyway, Sellers at some point says, where the whole tradition had thought of concepts as more basic than judgments, Kant goes the other way around and says, no, judgment is the most basic element, and you need to carve that up into concepts. Concepts are functions of judgment. And Sellers says, and we need to take the next step and understand judgments in terms of inferences. This is the inferentialist move that understands a judgeable as what can play the role of premise and conclusion in an inference. And then you have a project of starting with an inferential structure and understanding claimables, propositional contents, as roles with respect to reason relations, that is, as roles in relational structures where the relations are reason relations. And then, if you want to understand what's expressed by subsentential expressions, you're going to have to drill down again. And that's actually what we're going to do at the very end of the course, is look at how you might do that, use a substitutional scalpel to dissect inferential roles into things corresponding to the content of singular terms and predicates. That sort of explanation we're not that comfortable with. Chris Brown, one of the members of the role group, argues very convincingly that category theory is the sort of home language game of these relational top-down explanations, and that may be something I'll say something about later on. The tools we've had among the philosophers mostly developed in the context of functionalism, thinking about functional roles. And this is something I'll talk a little bit about already next week. The paradigm there, I think the sort of state of the art is David Lewis's understanding of functional explanations in two phases. You start with a theory in your puzzling language, and you ramsify it. Pull out a bunch of the predicates and put predicate quantifiers on for them. Get a ramsified theory, and then you look at what best realizers you can find for the roles that are defined by that ramsified second-order theory, what the best realizers of those roles are specified in your privileged vocabulary, in the one that you do understand. And this model is at the base of the Canberra program. I'll talk about this later. You can do a lot with that relation between two vocabularies, the vocabulary of realizers and the vocabulary you ramsify. That's a sophisticated, tractable, but it's not nearly broad or general enough for all of the top-down explanations that we're going to be interested in. So one of the things we have to develop along the way is a more flexible view of how one can have generally the functional explanation of something as the role that items are playing in a relational structure. I mean, those things, this is interesting, maybe it isn't. Anyway, there's an abstract question there, but specifically, meanings are roles with respect to reason relations. That's what propositions are. That's what concepts are. So we'd like to have a meta-vocabulary for talking about that sort of explanation. And though that bit of the project is less developed than others, I think we'll learn some things along the way. We've made some progress on that. Okay. Mechanically, stay up with the web page. I'll be putting stuff up there as it comes up. So it's a living thing. Look and see what material is up there. I will try to have what amounts to the handout for each week 24 hours in advance. I'll put it up on the website. It's basically in 4 parts. The 4 3-week parts. First 3 weeks, reasons and pragmatics. Week 3, we get the real pragmatics. Part 2 is weeks 4 through 6, is the semantics and logic and incompatibility stuff. 7 through 9 is on drilling down to, 7 through 9, I haven't mentioned this, is going to be about the social and historical aspects of conceptual content, enriching the pragmatics to include those. Sort of new stuff happens. And then weeks 10 and 11 are about drilling down to singular terms and predicates. So there's enough of the links, most of the links on the website are live. And on the thing I handed out, you see the web address that's my website. You have to drill down under the courses tab to get to this, but that will be fine. Okay, and anybody who actually is into the logic, we have, I think, a transformative perspective on contemporary trilogics, the Graham Priest's logic of paradox, the strong cleaning K3 that Kripke uses for his approach to the paradoxes, and the bizarre ST and TS versions of them, and the hierarchy of meta-inferences that the Buenos Aires people have just in the last years discovered and exploited. We have a new perspective on that I think is revelatory. I'll talk about what those things are in week 6, but I'm not going to go into all the details on that because you need to sort of already care about this bit of contemporary logic and philosophy of logic. But if you think you might be interested in that, there's lots of stuff. And chapters 3 and 5 are in the book, or the loci of that. So I think the only other thing to mention is we're meeting every Wednesday except October 2nd. My younger son is getting married. And Thanksgiving week. But we'll stuff the other weeks full. Okay. See you next week then.